stream of the audience will be kept off. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to type them into the chat box or into the Q&A box, both at the center bottom of your screen. And also, could you please add to the text of your question or comment who you're addressing it to? That just makes it easier for us. And also, if you could mention whether you're willing to speak or want us to read out, that also would make things very easy for us. So intellectual history and political thought in recent times has taken a global turn, and in an attempt to move beyond the dominance of the nation and the modern, it has brought some very significant methodological rethinking. The most significant of these contributions have been to question the globality of intellectual history traditions, and in turn urge scholars to introduce spaces beyond the Anglophone world within the realm of intellectual history as fertile grounds of ideation. How does one account for trans-temporal, transnational, and transcultural histories of religious ideas and institutions within these debates on global intellectual history? Are histories of religious ideas universal abstractions in their very nature? Moreover, how can we juxtapose these religious intellectual histories with histories of imperialism, political theology, and political economy? Therefore, conclusively, this panel will seek to address in what ways can we rethink political theology in radically egalitarian ways by overwriting existing power hierarchies of culture, language, race, gender, class, and ethnicity. We are joined here today by Professor Asad Ahmed, who's going to be moderating the session. Professor Ahmed is Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies and Director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He specializes in early Islamic social history and pre-modern Islamic intellectual history, with a special focus on the rationalist disciplines such as philosophy, logic, legal theory, and astronomy. He is the author of The Religious Elite of the Early Islamic Hijaz, Avicenna's Deliverance Logic, and pamphlets of themselves, Logic and Commentary in Muslim India. He's also the co-editor of several volumes of articles and in the aforementioned fields. I will let Professor Ahmed now take over. But since we have only 2 presentations in this panel due to unforeseen circumstances, unfortunately, we can have an elaborate conversation as well whilst the thing runs. All yours, Professor Ahmed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I excuse me, would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to offer my brief comments, and especially to you, Shivratri, for this opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to the dialogue. I should begin by saying that I do not work certainly on the topic of one of the papers. It was very interesting and it was enlightening for me to read. It helped me develop some of my own frameworks. And the other paper that I'll speak about in slightly more detail, again, is a part of India and a language that I also don't work on, but at least there are some closer overlaps in that particular case. And you would know immediately which papers I'm talking about. Both of them were absolutely wonderful, and they have begun to help me shape some of my own thinking. So I should begin by saying that I really enjoyed reading both papers. I was a bit fish out of water in reading Dr. Schalbroeck's paper. I know next to nothing about sub-Saharan Africa, the career of colonialism there, its post-colonial intellectual history, or the scholarship or the current debates about this region. But what the paper did allow me to grasp was the suitability of a particular call to do a certain kind of intellectual history. And it is one with which I very much identify. Outside of the rich details of the paper, which I imagine some of the audience members are going to be able to engage, Dr. Schalbroeck sends out a call to think about global history in a fashion that does not miss the local, that takes into account local agency as an encounter within an encounter. I very much like that expression. It's something that I have myself been moving towards, following the moment in which we have arrived now in our scholarship, where we think about the encounter with the West and with Europe, not just as an encounter of domination, but one that was also an adaptive encounter. So the work calls upon us not just to take the colonial models and frameworks as constricting narratology, but also as items adapted by the local figures. And these figures themselves stand in a complex relationship with each other and with those who narrate them through complex networks, through spaces, and through their various motives. And all of this is very beautifully and wonderfully and in good detail in the short paper laid out by the author. Power balances in such cases then get modulated with the introduction of such forms of complexity in writing global intellectual history, again, an approach to which I'm very sympathetic. And I have, in fact, often worried about the turn to the global. I'm, trained as a philologist, trained by students of Orientalists. Much of my time is spent on technical texts in various languages in the pre-modern period. So, the new framework of the global, and which is now turning towards world history, is something that I very much cherish and I'm very excited about. But at the same time, I worry that the question of local agency and the global through the local might be lost. But this paper reminds us of the complexity of the frameworks that we need to deploy. In other words, the call here, the broad call of the paper appears to me to be to modulate the global in a meaningful local way through these various aspects that are adaptive. This is all I'm afraid I would say about the paper, because I was drawing from it the larger argument that was being presented by the author. I cannot comment on the specific content, the technical details and specificities. So having said that, I would now turn briefly again to the paper by Dr. Ashraf. Again, I very much enjoyed reading this paper. It speaks of the reformist work of a figure from Kerala, Sanaullah Makti, and a really interesting figure. I did not know about him until I read this paper. And it's about his career during the colonial period in South Asia. He is an interesting figure, it appears to me, in that he produced defenses of the Prophet against Christianity, defenses of the figure of the Prophet against the polemic of Christian missionary activity and attacks in the vernacular. And he speaks also about how the Arabic script was used in the production of vernacular, and how the force of print culture was fully deployed to this purpose by this figure at a critical moment of encounter. Dr. Ashraf also points out the global as well. The responses that issue from Makti, the scholar who is the topic of his paper, were interestingly extracted in many cases from the Christian and Western material itself. So I find that element rather interesting too. They use, this particular scholar uses biblical form scholarship, for example, and perhaps in an ironic twist and an interesting case of irony, the author seems to engage certain Enlightenment source critical methods, including Newton's approach, in a defense of Muhammad himself, thus partly responding to the critique coming from Christian missionaries against Muhammad and Islam, while at the same time embracing certain others. In other words, creating a certain transregional, both transregional temporal and a cross-temporal approach to the formation of his apologetics in Islam. Now, since I know a bit more about this field, because it overlaps with my work on India, which is mostly in the northern areas in Arabic and Persian, Urdu and so on, and Punjabi and such, I can see certain overlaps. And in fact, I had some questions for Dr. Ashraf for him to reflect on. So in my own work as a scholar of pre-modern Islam, what I see in the kinds of arguments that are presented in this paper, that is the arguments of Makti, I can see the entire tradition of early Islamic theology being used in certain ways. This early tradition is in fact a disputation culture, both intra-sectarian, so early Muslim theological traditions that are developing and becoming mainstream through various methods of through various means, through networks, through geographical locations, through support from patrons, from the support of the central caliphate, and so on. Now, so this early tradition is both a disputation culture. On the one hand, it's intersectarian, but it's also cross-denominational. The early theological tracts are indeed written in majalis, in these gatherings where there are reports about Christians, Jews, Manichaeans, and so on participating. Early kalam, which is the word that is often translated as a compromise, as theology in the Islamic tradition, is a disputation culture. And what I see in the work of this particular author although he's interestingly drawing from the non-Muslim sources in his response, the framework, the mode of inquiry and response seems to remind me of that, the continuity of that tradition throughout, from the beginning of Islam up until this period. So my question is basically, where does this incorporation of the European tradition fit into internal discourses? Going back to what Dr. Schalbroeck was saying, or in her work, where do we see the mark of the tradition from within in these responses, even as the external tradition is being deployed? In the Indian, again, there's a work, a journal that is mentioned, started by this figure called Tuhfatul Akhyar. Now, I was immediately reminded, because I'm thinking through the context of India and the text, I'm immediately reminded of the Tuhfatul Akhyar fi Ihya Sunnat Sayyid al-Abrar by the much older contemporary of Makti, Abdul Hayy Lakhnavi, who dies in 1887. And now, this particular work is aimed at the revival of the veneration of the Prophet in the context of India. So we have two titles, one of them a rather famous work by a rather famous scholar, deployed precisely at the time where these tensions and questions about Muhammad and veneration of Muhammad, internal disputes about whether Muhammad is in principle and logically the final prophet of Islam, or whether God can in fact produce another Muhammad. There's an internal theological debate in South Asia taking place precisely at this time when this work is produced. It made me think about, where do we link the local and internal questions and internal theologies and debates with this interesting stretch through the encounter, within the encounter, going into Europe and European works? How do you place the debates about Muhammad against the Christian missionaries within the context of these internal developments? And how do they relate? I mean, the kind of work he's doing, the reformist work that Makti is doing, how does it relate, for example, to the movement of reformists such as those who established the Muhammad Anglo-Oriental College, which becomes Aligarh, right? So this is established in 1875, around the same time. I also have a critical question here. So former set of questions were more to draw your attention to the local environment and linking that with the global, but and so those are a set of questions to gain information from you. But my critical question is, you talk about his engagement with modernity, and I'm curious about what expressions or terms are being used by him, for example, to refer to this thing that we call modernity. In Arabic, there's a word called hadatha, which is out of place. It's a very strange neologism. It's a literal, practically literal translation of modernity in Arabic. And then once that translation comes into Arabic, then there's an engagement with translated works from Europe. And then, of course, there are local aspects to it too, internal aspects to it too. But this expression, once it comes into Arabic and is coined into Arabic, then modernity is sort of born. So I'm curious about what's happening with this particular author. How is he engaging modernity? What is the vocabulary of interaction that he's deploying? What is the idea of modernity in late 19th century South Asia? So those are some of my questions. I had more, but I think this is, a lot for us to chew on between the two papers. Again, I'm very grateful to have read them. I'm looking forward to pursuing both your works and to learning from you going forward for my own benefit. So I now yield the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your crucial comments, and thanks, Vatri, for organizing this workshop and giving a lot of ideas, updates about the workshop and everything. Should I directly come to your questions, or should I read out
I think
the paper?
it's better if we have a presentation first, because the audience doesn't have the pre-circulated papers, right?
Okay.
It's best to have a 12-minute, 12-minute presentation so that you can walk us through your basic ideas and then maybe respond to Professor Ahmed's very insightful comment.
Sure. So let's start. I will share my screen first. So as already Asad has told that I'm talking about a particular reformer, columnist, and a Muslim modernist who works basically in vernacular Malayalam in southern part of India. He was largely basically writes on a lot of polemical debates between the Christian missionaries. So, so he was the first intellectual, the Muslim intellectual who talks against the missionaries, and his intellectual efforts to counter missionary propaganda that highlight Islamic reformers' openness to using novel methods and modern conventions of religious discourse and theological disputations across the Indian and European world. In his 30 monographs published between 1884 and 1912, Makti Sanaullah Makti Tangal, Sayyid Sanaullah Makti Tangal, has adopted novel conventions of textual criticism, mainly engaging with Western biblical sources and theological thoughts, subjected various biblical Malayalam translations to polemical scrutiny, and used information drawn directly from these texts to combat the vernacular writings of Christian missionaries rather than taking his views from the Islamic textual traditions. So here we will, in a couple of minutes, I will go back to the 19th century polemics written by the Christian missionaries. What kind of writings were there, and what was its characteristic natures? Who was the what was how Makti was trying to combat it? And before that, I just want to give you a brief idea about who is Said Sanullah Makti Tangal. So as on the screen, I already put that how Makti as a Makti tries to reformulate modernity in his own ways. And I will come back to that once I will answer Professor Asad's questions in a very brief way, because this is this kind of a idea which I tried to give to you, but I want to come back to the uh, particular vocabulary which he put forward. So as a modernist, he is trying to uh, collaborate with colonial people in a way that how the kind of secular and modern education, especially the learning languages to interpret scriptural Islam in their own ways. So that was how he was trying to how he's trying to become defensive, become from the both external and internal changes. At the same time, so he was actually his father was his family was from Hadramis, who was migrated from Yemen to Kerala in the 16th century. Born into a rationally oriented new scientific world, the intellectual heritage of Hadramis had a colossal impact on Makti's childhood and education. During his younger days, he worked as an excise officer under the British government up to the age of 35. In the intellectual domain, Makti realized the power of printed text as a supplement to his verbal involvement. The printing of more than 30 monographs rebuking Christian missionaries, which continued till his death in 1912. His Malayalam publication, Parobagari, which means the benevolent, from Calicut and Kochi since 1898, articulated his defensive responses on Islam against missionary writing and communicated his significant concerns about the Muslim community and suggesting reform through internal change. Bhakti deemed the technology of print to fashion and consolidated the agency of Muslims outside the bound of colonial rule, which afforded them personal empowerment and moral responsibility for religious change. His journalistic activity started with writing columns for the Malayalam weekly Satya Prakasha, which means True Light, in 1888 as sub-editor, which he communicated his significant concerns about the reformation of Muslim community. He also started an Arabic Malayalam journal, which is called Arabic Malayalam is actually Malayalam written in Arabic script. Tuhfatul Akiyar wa Hidayatul Ashraf, which means a gift and instruction to noble people, which published articles on religious and secular themes under titles like local and overseas news, Quranic interpretation, Islamic history, and other various theological issues. He also established a Muhammadiyah press, which is his ambitious project to publish his own works, but but due to substantial financial liabilities, he has closed it. In his career as a vernacular reformer, he mainly posed an inquiry of how a Muslim could be modern with the bounds of Islam. So Makti was the first Muslim reformer to write in Malayalam, who energetically strove to create discursive and institutional spaces that would allow Kerala Muslim to access uh, modern education. He also called as a Mujaddid, a modernist who took modernity in intellectual and political terms, a deliberate effort, conscious effort to renew Islamic faith and reformulate Islamic values and principles that distinguished Islamic contribution to European vis-a-vis a dialogue on colonial categories of modernity. As a significant educational visionary, he tries to bring individual moral responsibility and helping to bring a collective identity of Muslims in the 19th century. I will just come back. I will just go back how he became a reformist. So, in his reformist studies, he was trying to bring the scriptural piety that he tries to divide what is forbidden and what is allowed in Islam based on scriptures. So his efforts to teach in vernacular language Malayalam was absolutely based on his idea to think about this true Islam, and every person has the ability to read and interpret the Quran, the scripture of Islam, in their own ways to understand what exactly they want to be to model. So in this way, he is trying to rejected the claim of modernity as a Western project and asserted the intellectual and philosophical superiority of Islam as a place of enlightenment, progress, and prosperity. On the whole, challenging the Orientalist conception of Islamic tradition as irrational, defective, and backward looking, Makti conceived Islamic modernity as a practical and feasible program of reform and was always engaged with the realities of human situation and how to amend it through abstract philosophical or theological argumentation. In this milieu, we should locate Makti's anti-Christian polemics. So during the 19th century, since the 16th century, a lot of missionaries are coming to Kerala, and in Malabar, it was basically the Basel evangelical missionary from Basel was largely worked. So they also printed a lot of tracts trying to think about questioning various Islamic principles. So while at the first moment, I've just come back to so most central allegations made by this Christian propaganda during the 19th century was about the life of Muhammad. In their writings, Makti cited various European depictions of Muhammad as licentious, ambitious, and violent. He was labeled as a barbarian and an impostor. Missionaries argued that the arrival of Muhammad was never foretold by earlier prophets, especially Moses in Torah and Jesus. They also alleged that Muhammad never performed any miracles or foretold the future as Jesus did and never demonstrated any witness to his prophecy. One of the important work during the 19th century was Herman Gunder, who was also known as the father of Malayalam language and a philologist based in South India. So his Muhammad Charitram or History of Muhammad was was largely celebrated by the missionaries. So in uh, this particular work questions a lot of tries to compare prophet with Jesus. So, and it says that most of the exalted words attributed to Muhammad regarding God in the Quran were taken from the Torah. If there is a comparison between the three scriptures, that is the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran was inferior as it never showed the strength of God's love and holiness. Through this accusation, the author meant to question the revelation of Prophet to Muhammad, and he expressed his intention to prove the Quran as homemade. The second allegation in this text was against the personality of Prophet. The author questioned Muhammad's character as missionaries. Muhammad's character also as voluptuous who founded the sensual religion, Islam for lust, which was evident from the number of women he kept. Muhammad's sexual license to his followers, according to him, was contrary to the natural and the divine law, reinforced the image of Muhammad's profligacy and the licentious nature of Islam. So this is a biography of Prophet Muhammad, also accused theologically and politically. The faith and success of Islam were due solely to the sword and wealth, unlike Christianity, which converted through love and compassion. So in another tract, which was published by Basel Evangelical Missionary Press in 1910, as also comparing Jesus and Muhammad. So there are two texts identical. This one is about Jesus or Muhammad who would lead to paradise, and there is another text is Jesus or Muhammad who is greater. So in these texts, These authors are trying to argue that Muhammad was a mortal and a sinner, but Jesus is God's son and therefore a real prophet. So Christian apologetic criticize Muhammad and Islam's fraudulent character, failing to authenticate his prophethood. So written in Malayalam and in a popular style, these tracks' main objectives were to convince Muslims about the fallacies and hollowness of Islam and Quran as well, to denigrate the personality of Prophet Muhammad. In other ways, there was a proliferation of popular Christian print in Malayalam and Arabic Malayalam that attacked both Islam, both in its high and popular forms, and that sought to draw Muslims to the Christian fold. This propaganda then produced a language, arguments, and framework that would be adopted by those who sought to counter it. The criticism raised by the Christian missionaries, so especially with Makti's interaction. Makti came with the first prophetic biography by a Muslim in Malayalam called Nebinadayam, which has been translated very periphery as coin for the prophet, which he is, I think, he tries to shows that every coin you have, every Muslim is obliged to uh, give money to Makti to defend Muslims, to defend Muslim, to defend prophet. So in this biography and in his another monograph called Satya Darshini, which is called Evidence of Truth, published in 1901, his main objective was to counter the biography of Herman Gundert and another English biography produced by William Muir called Life of Muhammad. He stated that the lack of biographical work in Malayalam stipulating eulogies of our beloved prophet and critically responding to defamations against him drive me into agony. The main intention of my biography should postulate convincing replies to every European scholars and missionary who slander our beloved prophet. So in this thing, uh, he's trying to put forward the Muhammad as a historical figure. One thing we have to keep in mind, till 19th century, there are number of poetries, like poetries venerating prophet in a kind of fanciful way. Like there are the Maulid text, which is talks about the life of Muhammad, recounting his miracles, narrating his relationship with natural and other living beings, his lifestyles. So it's all these things are trying to venerate Prophet Muhammad rather than giving a historical account. So Makti is trying to say that, see, those poetries are something only venerating the Prophet. They are not giving something historical to me. So he's trying to come with something historical with Prophet. So and what he's doing about, he is defending the character of image through a historical critical discourse. He also comes with different other monographs, which something like Parkalita Porkalam, which talks about who is the arena for comforter. Then Trishiveperu Kristiya Vayadappu, silencing the Trishur Christians, and Tandan Kondachenda, which are this kind of thing, this kind of monographs which he bring is trying to endorse Muhammad in biblical lines, like how Muhammad has been. So he is in all these monographs, he is trying to bring Muhammad in the biblical lines through quoting different biblical translations and interpretations. So one of the main arguments put forward by Makti was regarding the inclusion of Muhammad in the predestined chain of prophet to which Moses and Jesus belong. Such an addition to this old chain was a deliberate attempt to establish a connection to people of the book as well as to develop the life history of Muhammad through the same literary line of Jesus. The effort of shaping Muhammad in biblical lines and asserting him as a biblical figure was supposed to convince the people of the book, which refused to recognize Muhammad as a prophet like their own. Bhakti shaped the image of Prophet of Islam. Along biblical lines are typically exemplified in the theme of Annunciation. Being regarded as a prophet whose selection was predestined in the Old and New Testament, Muhammad's actual emergence in Arabia was annunciated by the previous prophets, to whom the aim of God's historical scheme was revealed in advance and whose task was to pave the way for the emergence of Muhammad. So in this trying to say that Annunciation program, he's trying to say the perception of par Khalif indicates and substantial reference of the significant prophecy concerning the prophet. He cited George Sale an Orientalist, and a practicing solicitor from 1734 who translated Quran and Bible in English. Quran in English. Then Godfrey Higgins and John Davenport, both are European scholars who write a biography, claim that Jesus addressed the Paraclete. The Perikleos refers to Muhammad. Makti proceeded to expose and refute the Christian mistake about the Paraclete. The Paraclete was not, as the Christian believed, the Holy Ghost, but the Comforter and Intercessor, precisely significates Prophet's other name Ahmed in the sense of the most praised one. He argued that the original Greek orthography of the word was Parakleos, which means the praised one, showing resemblance to Muhammad's name praiseworthy. Makti's linguistic skill in English gave him an advantage for us critically analyzing the biblical and other critical literatures published in English from Europe. Simultaneously, his knowledge of Urdu and Persian also helped him assert the questionable textual integrity of Bible based on critical commentaries and polemical literature published in other parts of India. Thus, a great deal of scholarship he cited was from 19th century critical commentaries on Bible. This was a strategy developed by modern Muslim intelligentsia. They began to welcome those writings of Western scholars that explicitly showed sympathy to Islam. Some of them include are the Gospels of Haran, theological criticism written by Thomas Scott, Isaac Newton's commentaries on Bible. Other examples include writing on the his other examples are writings on civilization by Edward Gibbon, Godfrey Higgins, etc. Critical literature and periodicals against Roman Catholics from Unitarian sects such as Christ Life and Unity, published from England, which questioned various Christian beliefs, are other examples of Western literature cited by Makti. So Makti's biography compared the success of Muhammad and Jesus in many contexts. So Makti cited arguments from Maulana Rahmat Allah Kairanvi, Izar al-Haq, a long and detailed reply to the evangelical missionary Karl Gottlieb Pander's Mizan al-Haq, the balance of truth, especially concerning why Muhammad received divine help and how Islam became successful in Arabia. So in 1854 in Agra, there was a great debate was happening between missionaries and Muslim reformers. So from missionary side, the German evangelical missionary Karl Gottlieb Pander, and from the Muslim side it was uh, Rahmatullah Karanvi, and assisted by Dr. Wazir Khan. So we can find a lot of similarities between their arguments in Makti's works. So in one of Makti himself states that he gets influences from Karanvi's Izarul Haq, a biography which was produced, which was a reply to the this German evangelical missionaries' writings. In his biography, Makti argued that Muhammad's teaching of a new faith was purely religious and the development of his political aim was eventually emerged only as a defensive mechanism, a response against the enemy attacks, and therefore a subservient one. So his constant argument against accusation of political ambition designated Muhammad's role as the sole comforter promised by God to whom people of the book united for religious salvation under the banner of Islam and its doctrines. Makti stated Edward Gibbon's works and reiterated that in short time Muhammad seized the important cities, sacred places, and worshipping abodes because he is the chosen messenger who never accomplished by Moses and Jesus, substantiated the purity and victory of Muhammad over Jesus. So in all these writings, Bhakti is getting appreciation from the various newspapers publishing during that moment. So here he is trying to say the prophetic love is based on bringing Muhammad into history, or Muhammad of history, who lived in the 7th century Arabia. So one of the newspaper published in Kerala during that time wrote, even the Muslim brothers who were backward in the field of education and scholarship in the Malayalam language set a milestone when the famous Mapla orator Makti wrote the life of Prophet Muhammad. For the first time, a person from a community that only knows the Arabic Malayalam script writes in Malayalam language. He is making a huge effort for the emancipation of Mapilas, or the Malabar Muslims, through education and literary engagement. Bhakti's work was very similar to other South Asian intellectuals during that time who produced a lot of hagiographical biographies on Muhammad during that time. In the context of this, Kesia Ali writes, Muslim accounts likewise vary, sometimes telling an encyclopedia, but a roughly chronological tale, often selective, thematic, and devotional, all mixed miraculous events with the daily interaction with family, followers, and foes. These tales elevated Muhammad's stature. They also exalted a particular faction, promoted distinctive theological positions, and even served as a bulwark against Christians and Jew apologetics. So, in short, a great deal of scholarship cited from the 19th century critical commentaries on the Bible was actually a critique of Christianity, was that it was done using Western barometers. Makti's defense of Islam therefore could bear scrutiny not merely when looked at through the lens of Islamic tradition, but the so-called rational thought, or the so-called the lens of not merely when looked at the lens of Islamic tradition, but the so-called rational thought and argument of the West. The rationality of Western theology and history was acknowledged. Therefore, even Christianity was he is trying to put defensive against Christianity being antithetical to that of spirit. In his work, Fazlur Rahman defines Islamic modernism as a project that arose to defend Islam as a theoretical level by choosing to respond those of accusations that Western critics has raised. He traces the phenomenon to European dominance in the 19th century when Western scholars raised questions about Islam and its doctrines. So Makti is aimed to try to communities' energies to bring out. So as he said always, we should print small tracts and pamphlets in Malayalam language and circulate them throughout Kerala. As in the case of missionaries themselves, the print was an essential part of campaign. What is noteworthy in the defense of Islam and its counterattack on Christianity is that Makti marshaled arguments based on his formidable knowledge on Western theology and commentaries on the Bible as well as historical work. And just a final paragraph which I will try to conclude. So here I'm not trying to give a kind of spiritual dimension to his writing or what about his writing about writing about Muhammad, but I'm trying to say that how he expressed and engaged with the social and intellectual challenges of the 19th century. So he postulated two significant developments in the Muslim intellectual arena in colonial Kerala. So as a polemist for defending Islam, so he commenced a age of rational thought opposing the Christian Enlightenment project. Secondly, the indigenous reaction throughout against the Christian missionaries. He started something which is very important, the communitarian identity of Kerala Muslims during the 19th century. Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Shall I now give my presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just wasn't entirely sure about the order. Sure. Okay. Right. I think that should be visible now. Okay. Just a quick check. Is the PowerPoint visible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Great.
yes,
Yeah. Would be a shame to start if no one could see the screen. Okay. So I'm actually now hearing your presentation. You know, the similarities and the differences between the two cases is going to be very interesting to unpack. In this paper, we will be going to colonial Central Africa, and what actually prompted my paper was the correspondence between these two men. Gustav Hulstaert, the man on the right, is a Belgian Sacred Hearts missionary active in the Belgian Congo. He is active in this area, so in the northeast, and Alexis Kagame, a Rwandese priest. Now, at that time, we're talking about the 1940s. Both the Congo and Rwanda were in Belgian hands. And the short story about these two men is that Gustav Hulstaert, the missionary, the Belgian missionary, he has a journal on, he's very into science, as you can see on the picture, and he has a journal on African culture. And he asks Alexis Kagame, he writes to him like, could you, because he considers Alexis Kagame an expert on Rwandese society, he asks, can you contribute to my journal? Kagame, in the beginning, he's very surprised, as you know, in grande surprise, big surprise. But quickly, he kind of he becomes very articulate, and they have this over the course of a good decade, and this very interesting conversation back and forth via letters about a wide range of things. First of all, the universal nature of Christianity. It's not a Western thing, it's a universal thing. Traditional African society. What is traditional African society? Critiquing of colonial rule. Now, Kagame, he in the end does write a few contributions for Hulstad's journal, and one is actually about a cow market. And he claims like the fact that the Belgian colonial authorities ended this cow market is just an intrusion in the traditional rights of the Wendy's king. And so it was actually, you know, about culture, society, and everything, but also a stab at the authorities. And well, everyone just got angry. All the authorities started reacting. They were already suspicious about the whole collaboration, and so they clamped down. And it actually, you know, the collaboration actually really ended after this, and it nearly ended the journal. So that would be the short story about these two men. If we, at around this time, maybe a name people will know if they know anything about missionaries in the Belgian Congo, it's Placide Stempels, the man here, and his work, Bantu philosophy. And he was sort of one of the first European missionaries to say, like, actually, Africans have their own way of thinking, which we should respect and try to understand. It also caused a lot of controversy. And so if we take these three figures together and their ideas, and the fact that they meant a critique of how colonialism and how missionaries at that time were operating, that gives us sort of two narratives. We have sort of colonial history, the colonial history narrative, where we speak about, you know, these missionaries and these priests, they were critical voices, they were deviating from the mainstream, and they, you know, got a very firm reaction from the authorities. If we sort of look at it from a post-colonial perspective, it's often this idea of missionaries being agents of empire. So, you know, the sort of church is colonial, equals colonial state. And although they sort of say, oh, these men, these missionaries who say we need to respect African society, you know, that's better than the first generation, which said they had to, which claimed they had to eradicate traditional society. But at the same time, they said, well, they're still quite paternalist, and men like Kagame, they're the first African scholars who actually are a bit more self-conscious, but at the same time, they claim that men like Kagame suffer from what they call the Oedipus complex. You know, they try to kill the father, be critical about colonialism, but in the end, they actually just copy colonial's ideas. So this is sort of the two narratives that we have. And I just felt like both of these narratives actually depart from divisions. And so I was hoping to give this a sort of, you know, this story, and especially the collaboration between the two, the missionary and the priest. I wanted to give it a sort of a global turn makeover. But then I think we all know that by now, about like 10 years after the seminal publications, it's a bit of an embarrassment of the methodological riches. And I felt a bit paralyzed when, how do I actually start studying this thing? And then this workshop seemed like a good opportunity to actually start thinking about it. So it's really work in progress, and I'm glad the paper at least made a bit of sense to an outsider. So what I actually want to do with this paper is sort of use this case to think about the methods of global intellectual history and its religious version, world Christianity, to sort of think like what have we gained, but what are the pitfalls? I think so a global approach where it's mainly the sort of the global perspective is done on an analytical level. So it's the scholar who actually adds that global perspective, has been done for the two figures, for Kagame, the priest, and for Hulstad, the missionary, separately. For example, the fact, you know, They compare his ideas on what philosophy should be with those of Aristotle. And I think the fact that it sort of departs from the fact that these men were thinking about comparison, that actually makes sense. And it also allows us to sort of see things that the men themselves did not perhaps see. For example, the fact that they created a very static image of African society. But at the same time, and this sort of ties in with general scholars of religion in Africa, like David Maxwell, were sort of a bit hesitant about the whole global Christianity approach, because they said, you know, it's sort of, by thinking in this sort of very broad framework, it has advantages, but at the same time, there's sort of very small details that get overlooked, very crucial things that we just cannot unpack with this framework. And so we get the successor. Well, world Christianity develops at the same time, but also sort of responds to the sort of global Christianity approach. And the interesting thing is, like it says, the study of Christianity in terms of its regional and national particularity. So really that interaction between the global and the local. I think if we sort of speak of the former, the global approach being really about the similarities and sort of maybe erasing the differences a bit. This, you know, the first one, the colonial critique, was really about the differences. Then we had a bit too much similarities. I think the world Christianity approach sort of promises a better balance between differences and similarities, which I think is quite crucial when trying to understand what is happening in this case. But then I realized when sort of going through the literature that we actually still have quite a canon. Everyone is still talking about Placide temples and Bantu philosophy. It's like the only thing, the only figure people are sort of talking about. And I think, yeah, rethinking, a lot of work has been done on adding African voices into the story, but I think it's also interesting. We need to sort of diversify the European counterparts as well. I think especially in terms of power dynamics, most work is still largely about missionaries and their converts. Now, Kagame, he was already converted to Christianity. So I think the fact that these, you know, the sort of the ideas that have been developed so far actually, you know, they don't apply when we're thinking about these two figures. And I think they have a very interesting power dynamic, because in the end, yes, we have a European and an African person, but at the same time, I think it's also important to take into account Gustav Husserl, the missionary. He was actually an ordinary missionary. He was also Flemish speaking, and in the Belgian Congo, the French, the elite was French speaking, and the people on the ground were mostly Flemish speaking. So, and Kagame, he is a Tutsi figure. He has a background, he's very strongly connected to the royal court. So he is actually, in terms of, you know, he's part of the indirect rule elite. So actually, in terms of rank, you would almost say that Kagame is slightly, you know, higher up. Then I think also the fact that, you know, he's an elite figure, but at the same time, he's really trying to grasp what he calls, you know, it's sort of the oral traditions of Rwandese society. So he's sort of an elite figure who wants to sort of speak for the ordinary people in Rwanda. So again, here we sort of see that sort of elite, which we heard about yesterday as well, the sort of that dynamic, that tension. Interesting is that both men, you know, the fact that they found each other is not a coincidence. They were both really into this what we call salvation anthropology. So this idea of we, through science, need to save traditional society from disappearing due to colonialism, which for Kagame is a bit of a tension, because, you know, he gets part of his influence by being part of the colonial indirect rule elite, but at the same time he's critiquing it. And I think with with Hulstead, we see the same. He critiques colonial rule, but at the same time, he's just part of that structure. So we see these sort of tensions which we could not really grasp with that global perspective. I think also one interesting thing, these two men, they feature in a novel, which is also not a surprise because they are very, very strong personalities. We think of missionaries as being very, they're very driven people. So I think we also need to take that into account. We're taking two very strong personalities put together. And then also just so these were all things I found that we could not really grasp with that global perspective. And but even with world Christianities, I felt that there were some things that so I kind of started thinking like, which tools could I actually use to sort of grasp all these complexities that were going on in this case, because I felt that was really crucial to actually understand what was going on. And I think, I mean, these are the ones I sort of came up with for the moment. I think what I quite like is, the idea of networks. We often see everyone in terms of before or after temples, yeah? And so we would sort of see these two men, Hulstead and Kagame, as in function of Plassey temples. But I think, in the end, they were all part of a larger network of scholars, missionaries, priests, colonials, who were all thinking about colonialism, encounter, traditional society, modernity. So here people are more, compared to your paper, people are here more thinking about traditional society and what is it and how to safeguard it. And so they commented on each other's work, they agreed, they disagreed. So I think that sort of network, or perhaps even like Miles Larmer yesterday said, a sort of epistemological community might actually be a nicer way of sort of trying to grasp those interactions. Again, like I said, the relationship between these two men actually quite difficult, and I found that the notion of push and pull factors was perhaps an interesting one to think through. Scholars often use push and pull when thinking about why were Africans attracted by Christianity? Because, for example, it offered literacy. But I think for both men, this sort of, this is sort of in general, but I think it also works for this collaboration. Hulstead, as much as he was interested in Kagame's work, he also just wanted a contribution because his periodical was, hard work. And so he thought, free contributions, why not? Kagame, I think on the whole was sort of, he was sort of known as a defender of the Tutsi royal court. So he thought, well, I actually have a platform to sort of spread my ideas. So these, again, I think the sort of push and pull factors, the fact that both, this was the time of the Second World War. These men were always, with their ideas. I think that the fact that they were not always got opposition from quite a lot of corners. The fact that I think that also sort of pushed these two figures together. The notion of, I like that in your paper you were speaking about polemics. I think this paper, these two men, I think were really trying to do something different. And I like the idea of translation and dialogue, the fact that they were literally translating texts. But I think on the whole, what they were trying to do between themselves was also sort of trying to put the other person's ideas in their own language, so make the other intelligible to themselves. But at the same time, they were trying to, the dialogue, trying to understand the other participant in his terms. So I think, I think there's a part in a letter where Hulstead really says, like, please help me see through African eyes. But at the same time, he was trying to, like, explain this to his European readers. So I think there's an interesting dynamic between trying to see the similarities but also trying to see the differences. So I think, I don't want to choose between either translation or dialogue. I think I'm just going to use both of the terms. And then also spatiality. Spatiality, this is a correspondence that happens between the Congo and Rwanda. Now, most correspondence either goes within the two separate colonies, or between the Congo and Belgium, and so that between Rome and Africa. And so this actually sort of deviates from a normal axis. I also don't know about correspondence that happens, that does that trajectory for such a long period of time, because in the end, these men wrote between the 1940s and the 1970s. So I think that that's also very important to take into account. And the fact that, we say the authorities got, they received opposition from the authorities, but I think that that is too vague. We had people complaining about the pieces Kagame wrote in Leopoldville, the capital of the Congo, in Rwanda, in Katanga in the south of the Congo, in Brussels, in Rome. So I think the fact that this collaboration reverberated around, the whole of what was called Belgian Africa, I think is important. So I think that says a lot in a colony, in a colony that is actually as big as the Congo and Rwanda. So I think that's also important to take into account. How is this spatiality, how can we sort of link that to the subversive nature of what these two men were actually doing? And I think, if anything, the term encounter within the encounter, I found quite useful to sort of wrap my head around what they were trying to do, especially because it was an encounter on multiple levels. Colonialism, traditional society, but also these two men. So I think it's that multi-leveled encounter within the encounter, the complex power dynamics, and the fact that they were actually really questioning both actual and intellectual borders. I assume there are quite a few. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing from the audience other examples. Just maybe two things about the discipline. I think language, this is about African languages, translating them, but in the end, all scholarship, or most of scholarship, is Anglophone, Francophone. And even there we see Anglophone and Francophone scholars not reading each other's work enough. So I think, language, there is an issue on the side of the scholarship as well. And then interdisciplinary, and this would be a case that has history, colonial history, African studies, but I find that especially in times when, I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak here, because it's so often hard to just find people and actually be able to talk across disciplines. And then just actually to conclude, I think we all know that the global term was revisionist, but I think we need to, as we've all, everyone has actually done in his or her talk, is the fact that, 2021, it's a good time to start rethinking, have we been hitting new roadblocks, and how can we overcome this? And I think religion is a key aspect in understanding how can we innovate this field. And I know my paper was about Europeans and African elites, maybe not the most typical decolonization themes, but I think rethinking these figures too is also a crucial aspect of this decolonization endeavor. Thank you.
Right. So should we open it up? We already have questions from the audience. So I could open it up, or if you want to take a minute or two to respond to Professor Ahmed's initial comments, then we can do that, and I'll open it up in 5 minutes to the audience.
Should I respond to
Go ahead.
Professor Asad's
Yeah.
question? As Professor Asad has asked me, I will start with the first critical question about how he conceptualized Islamic modernity with some neologist concepts. As you already told about the Arabic term, actually, how the religious imagination of Makti has been imbued or injected into the Western liberal conceptualization. Actually, that was the base of modernity which Makti was talking about. So when Makti the three terms he put forward in his vernacular in Malayalam. That is, one is Purogati, uh, which is called progress, Parishkaram, which is called reform, and Abhivriddhi, which is prosperity. So these three terms, which he tries to give a framework for his modernity based on this progress and advancement, invoking the infrastructure and referent of modernity. And the second one, which he's actually trying to put forward about um, how the modern pedagogical philosophies can be comparing to Islam, especially the interpretation of interpretation of text. So while he's talking about uh, religion within the region, so he correlate the region with religion. Right? For example, he talks about Kerala Islam. So he's trying to appreciate how Islam can be uh, competent in Kerala in a way that if people, if the Muslims in Kerala learn Malayalam language and if they can interpret the Islamic scriptures according to their need, so the success they are successfully trying to be a part of Islam in the worldwide. That's how it's in that terms the conceptual boundaries of Islam has been they're broadening. The conceptual boundaries of Islam is broadening in that sense. So it's actually it's a means of reflection both in the self as well as a society. Uh, like a kind of a discursive tradition that the Islam has been already been trying to going back to the foundation of the scripts, the Quran and Hadith, and I hope it gives an idea about modernity which Makti is putting forward. And in the second question, which the two, three wide questions he asked me, one about the internal theological questions. So actually, when Makti was writing about, Makti was writing all these polemics, it was during the 19th century when this kind of devotional poetry was largely getting published a lot. For an example, as I uh, told earlier, the kind of hagiographies. These hagiographies are something the as the definition of hagiographies is still very wide. Right now in my PhD, I'm working on this hagiographies, how this devotional poetry giving a collective effort of writing history. So in the say but Makti is trying to criticize this devotional poetry as something scandalous. So those Sufi poets who is writing about Prophet Muhammad, his miraculous life, about his life, like the writing the life in a very different way, like just a kind of a veneration. So Makti is trying to bring these theological questions to put forward. For an example, at the same time, Zaid Ahmad Khan is also talking about these miracles in his reply to William Moir about the life of Muhammad. So the rationality, the irony is about this. So when Sayyid Ahmad Khan talks about miracles, he said that still we can bring the rational thought about this miracle. So even though Makti is also following the Sayyid Ahmad Khan's similar argument, because when he is talking, for an example, when Makti is talking about uh, splitting the chest of Muhammad during his childhood by the angel. So most of the devotional poets, talks about the same in a similar manner. But even though when Makti criticized these poetries, his biography include this aspect as an important aspect of prophethood of Muhammad. So uh, when Makki is trying to write a biography in five parts, like in five aspects. So as I already said, Annunciation is an important part. He is talking about these parts, which is very similar to what this devotional poetry talks about. So actually, he's bringing this kind of so it's kind of a history versus faith. When Makti is trying to bring Muhammad into history, but the Muhammadan faith is always there. So there is a kind of coalition between these two. And as you said, so this is it's very comparable to what Sayyid Ahmad Khan talks about during this. There is, so even though Makti doesn't speak about modern, when he is speaking about modernity, he's speaking about reformism. He is directly taking many ideas from Sayyid Ahmad Khan, but he never talks about there is a relationship. Is there any kind of uh, letters, a conversation with him? But we can find, especially in the field of education and learning languages, the similarity between them is really significant. At the same time, he talks about Al-Manar when he's talking about this trans-regional or trans-intellectual connections. He talks about Al-Manar, about this, about the ideas which he borrows from Al-Manar, from Egypt. And the first question which she talks about how it has been the continuity tradition. Uh, this this Abu, or there is a lot of polemical debates happening during those centuries. I think the similar argument, especially with when he is talking about criticizing the question of Trinity, the only new thing he is bringing in the in criticism is about its relation between Hinduism and because the Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva concept of trio concept in Hinduism is very similar to Trinitarian. So this is the only unique thing which Makti is bringing in his polemics. Other thing, most of the things we can see about the similar arguments with Abu Waraisa's interpretation of Trinitarian controversy and other theological disputes happening in the other parts of world. I think, and thanks for this Lucknowi's. I would really like to know, because this is my first time I'm hearing about this particular Lucknowi. Can you please repeat that name of that reform, that person who Tuhfatul Lakyar
Yeah,
Lucknowi?
this is the famous Abdul Hayy Lucknowi from the Farangi Mahalli family.
Okay.
I can send you the reference perhaps by email if you'd like.
Okay, I will great. I will be in touch with you with that. Yeah, thanks. I
Very
hope
much.
that thanks for this. Thanks for your brilliant questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're on mute. We can hear you.
Right. Sorry. I was just saying if Eva wanted to come in and respond briefly to your comments, because we already have a couple of questions from the audience. So yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah, maybe we can take the question and then I can sort of see how the...
All right.
They're both about methodology, I think. So I'm curious now.
Right. So from the audience, I think we have we have a question from Dr. Mirino Banerjee from St. Andrews. Let me see. Yes. Yes. Can we hear from you, Dr. Banerjee? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, both papers were absolutely fascinating. I want to take a cue from what Asad was mentioning about the tension between the global and the local, and can the global potentially obfuscate the local, which is of course a huge debate in my area of specialization in South Asian intellectual history. And I wanted to ask Eva this question because I've been reading up a lot on sub-Saharan, well, not a lot maybe, but a bit at least on sub-Saharan intellectual history. And I think I've been very inspired by a lot of the work, especially Rhiannon Stephen's kind of work about looking at this kind of paleolinguistics to really understand how we can understand intellectual history in non-literate context. That has been hugely inspiring for me because in South Asia as well, so much of what should be intellectual history is ignored as intellectual history because people tend to focus on text. And unless I completely misheard you, you as well said that we need to go beyond the Bandung moment, which is of course a thing both for India as well as Africa, going beyond these kind of elite post-colonial statesmen and so on. And I'm also being very inspired by Emma Hunter's work, which I also actually teach in my university, kind of looking at newspapers and archives. And you mentioned Miles's talk yesterday about about interlinking the intellectual and the social. So I guess my question to you would be, I mean, given the kind of fascinating archives you're looking at, the very rich kind of questions you're raising, I guess it's more a kind of a methodological question that where do you position yourself within these debates in the dialectics of the global and the local, and saving the richness of the local from the tyranny of the global maybe, and whether you see potential convergences between what you are doing and the kind of dissenses that we have in South Asian intellectual history as well. And where would you position yourself kind of intellectually or maybe even politically within those debates? I would be super love to hear from you and learn from you.
Eva, do you want to take another question from the audience, or do you want to respond to Dr. Banerjee first?
See, I think that was the only question for me.
No, there's one more question from the audience.
Oh, I think I think
go ahead. If you want to respond, go ahead.
I think before I forget what I want to say. Yeah. I'm still at this point not sure where I'm going to completely position myself in this whole global local debate, because I see advantages. I have the problem that I can always see the benefit of both the arguments, but I do think, and this is something that I sort of wanted to make a case for in my paper, also in terms of maybe sources, and I think I did not say enough of the sources that were actually involved in this paper. It's not only this correspondence, but it's also the fact that both of these men published a lot, and I quite like, both of these men were also doing a lot of oral history. And rather than almost say, after the text, no, we should look at the oral histories or whatever, but I'm almost like, can we actually put all of these, I mean, I never like choosing, so I always go for all of them. So I was wondering how, and especially, for example, here, we always see, especially when looking at figures like Alexis Kagame, he's not an unknown figure within the world of African philosophy, but everyone always focuses on 3 of his publications. All the rest is sort of what is sort of overlooked. And also the fact that how can we put, and especially what interested me here was this dialogue, not just between the 2 men, but also between what they say in correspondence, because I felt it was a sort of this was only read by 2 people, they didn't reckon a historian would actually look at this, I think, maybe. But so they had this sort of, I can speak my mind. And I think especially about these very complex questions, the universal nature of Christianity. And I see them just both trying ideas and then sort of linking back to their own research based on informants. So I think I quite like thinking about how can we sort of see all those sort of different forms of sources in dialogue with each other, and then thinking in terms of, this is one of the things that I wasn't entirely sure about. I don't want to say, oh, it's not the global, so it's definitely the local, or it's, I think that this is, like I said, I think the whole, how can we combine all those different frames, looking at the colony, the colonial frame, but also thinking how can we add Rome and Belgium into the picture. Where I'm afraid I don't have a sort of a this is where I would put myself at this point. It's, I think, an ongoing question, but I do think how can we, that fragmented nature of these collaborations of the scholars, the sources we are working, how can we put that sort of disadvantage, how can we turn that into an advantage? That's what I would sort of try and say. I hope that sort of gave a slight answer of what you were hoping.
Right, so we have another question from Orkumitra Ghotok, who's joined us from Heidelberg. I think this is more of an open-ended question for both of you because it's more on religion. So Orkumitra writes, thank you so much for the fascinating presentations. In my work, in her work on female gurus and their hagiographies, this usage of rationalizing strategies while talking about the miraculous appears as well. Can we actually see in such a strategy of using rationalist modes to establish the miraculous as a legitimate cognitive mode, as an act which is global? Right. Do you want to respond to that? Because we have only one more question, so that's fine.
Okay. As I told earlier, that I have seen a couple of references from Sayyid Ahmed Khan's works that he is trying to kind of giving a legitimacy of how the prophet, so they consider the prophet as the most superior person. So whatever happening to prophet, they are not they are not in a position to criticize them, or even in the in what extent they can criticize. It's up to. So when so at the, there are two things. One, the Christianity, or when the missionaries are talking about the miraculous deeds of Jesus Christ during that time. So at the same time, they are using the same balanced mode of keeping prophet as also the similarities. So when the comparison between Jesus and Muhammad usually comes by, so the question of miraculous rationality over miraculous never comes, because both, if they question this kind of miracles, then both they are in the same box, and same Pandora box when they talks about this rationality of miracles. So in that sense, I don't think during that moment, so the mode of questioning it is never comes up to during the 19th century. But when the later on, when because I also got a same question from David Martin, who talks about how the Syrian Christians uh, uh, it talks about Makti's work seems to recognize differences and defend within well-established European Christian traditions, but they also exist in South Asian Christianities, particularly Syrian Christians, who also questioned the divinity of Jesus Christ. Was there any recognition of such differences in Makti's works, since the divinity of Christ is a key question in both the case of Makti and the Syrian Christians? So I just want to correlate these two questions. Because when I visited British Library, and I have collected a lot of polemics between the Syrian Christians and Roman Catholics, I just want to, sorry, I couldn't enter those photos, because there are two particular tracks which I was really fascinating for me. One is about a sword against Christian Trinity. That is how they put it in English. Uh, the sword of God against Trinitarianism, which they called Isa Kantanam, or a kind of a blow to Isa. It's by J.B. Peter, a witness of the Lord Jesus. So it is translated to Malayalam by and Bhakti is actually citing this in his writing, and the other is also about is Jesus a God? So in these two in these two particular tracks, I'm just when I was reading, so the question of rationality they are talking about is questioning this miraculous deeds of Jesus Christ from the theistic missions. At the same time, uh, Bhaktis also talks about this Unitarian sects in Europe, who published a lot of polemics about like Christ life, unity, these kind of journals usually question about Roman Catholics, uh, about the Trinitarian controversy. So in that sense, I think that yes, there is this kind of established the Syrian Christians within the Christian tradition, there is established in the polemics there.
Right. So it seems like we don't have any more questions from the audience. In case the two of you have some summarizing thoughts on the panel, please feel free. We still have about 5 minutes before we wrap up the conversation. So. Okay. So I want to make a couple of comments as the moderator of this very fascinating panel. So my thoughts would essentially be that by looking at these different religions that the two of you have, Islam, Christianity, and in different contexts, so sometimes within the empire, sometimes on the end of the colonizer, sometimes on the end of the colonized. So if we can think in more abstract fashion, can we develop a global history of religion through comparative perspectives, like bringing the two of your works together? Or are there alternative models of thinking about more global ways to write religious histories by looking at certain universal concepts within all religions, like how do they think of humanity, how do they think of salvation, things like that? So I guess mine is a more open-ended question, inviting reflections from the two of you as to in what ways can we conceptualize global religious intellectual history and political thought, basically?
I'd be happy to comment on this one. Actually, I was hoping to develop this paper into something on Ubuntu thinking,
Okay.
which is, yeah, I thought it was too complex for a 15-minute talk, so I focused on the methodology thing. And Ubuntu is sort of an African notion of community, togetherness, solidarity. And yeah, it's often seen as African, but not ethnic, because, yeah, so the people are really struggling to sort of define, how should we define this, you know, what is it as a term, but also how should we define it in relationship to other ways of thinking. And I think on the whole, so far people have usually compared it. And I think Kagame would be a figure within this Ubuntu thinking. And he, you know, people have usually compared Ubuntu thinking with European concepts. And I felt that this case was an opportunity to really see, like, how are these people themselves, you know, how can we see comparison on an analytical level, but how can we actually strengthen all of this when we sort of take those, you know, that analytical level, the actors themselves thinking about these things. If we combine these things, you know, I think that sort of, yeah, makes for a richer combination. So again, I do think sort of seeing how do these actors depart from these notions and how are they trying to balance similarities and differences themselves. It not just us, but them themselves. I think that's also an interesting question to see how can we grasp what is actually happening. And I think, yeah, I'm still not entirely happy with my global local thing, but you know, I'll keep thinking about it.
If I might, I don't know how much time we have. I could just say, oh, we have a few seconds only. I think the issue is one of codes and categories. So when I was asked by a colleague to write a paper on what was philosophy in Muslim India, and I was completely stumped. I said, yeah, sure, why not? I know the text, I can say something about it, but when you start searching for, well, what was philosophy in Muslim India? And then you begin to wonder, well, how do I define philosophy? What are the categories and codes I'm using? If I use a particular expression philosophy, how do I locate it in the local Islamic languages? The question you're asking at the end is, I think, one that invites sort of second order reflections on what we're really asking. You know, we talked about African philosophy, for example. How do we come to terms to begin to answer that question? I mean, do we use some cognate of the word philosophy and try to locate its features in African intellectual history? Do we abandon the term philosophy? So, I mean, I am stumped at, you know, in trying to begin to answer these questions. But I guess now that we are out of time, we won't get anywhere. So,
but sorry. Yeah, sorry, your video got frozen for a second there. It's fine now. So yeah, so actually I think it's kind of nice that we can only start to answer these questions now, because that means we have more food for thought and reason to co-convene again in post-pandemic times and better circumstances. And on that note, I would like to thank everyone who has stayed with us through all the panels and through this panel. Also, thank you to both Eva and Muhammad for joining us with your very fascinating presentations. And of course, thank you, Professor Ahmed, for joining us and enriching our conversation with your brilliant insights into the two presentations. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. See you. Good night.